There are so many people now talking about how bad the job market is. And recently on YouTube, I've seen a massive amount of Gen Z graduates, especially talking about how bad the job market is and how, in many cases, they just can't find any job or can't find a job in their field and so on. And I mean, it's bad for everybody now. I mean, if you're a new graduate, it's horrible, but it's still bad even for a lot of people who've been in the job market for years and have been working for years. It's still bad. But I'm seeing a lot of this stuff, a lot of this content from Gen Z graduates, and they're talking about how hard it is to apply to jobs because there's so many ghost jobs, for example, or how they can't get jobs in their field and so on. And what strikes me about it is that it's very similar to what things were like when I graduated. So I'm a millennial, and I graduated in the middle of the Great Recession. And back then, we pretty much had this horrible job market where you just couldn't get a foothold in anything. Back then you couldn't even get McDonald's to look at you. You could apply to triple digit jobs and not hear anything, not even get an interview. Or if you got an interview, you just many times never even heard back. So it was discouraging even on a good day. And even back during the Great Recession, you had a lot of jobs that were ostensibly entry level, but they required experience. And so, if it's entry level, how can they require experience? And if you need job experience to get a job, then how do you get experience that lets you get a job? And it was just as infuriating back then as I'm sure it is now, especially for new graduates and new job seekers. But don't worry, I'm not trying to pull well, back in my day, Sonny, we didn't call them ghost jobs. No, not like that. Some of the terminology may be different, but I realize it's just the same horrible, rigged system that it used to be and maybe always has been. I don't know. But society has just completely lost the plot when it comes to jobs. And I guess it's lost the plot with everything else too, but that's another story for another video, I guess. Once upon a time, I think it was understood well enough that a job was for supporting a wife and children, and it was for buying a house and a family car. Obviously, that was a very long time ago. Maybe the occasional restaurant meal for a special occasion like someone's birthday, and maybe a yearly family vacation. Stuff like that. It was a very humane thing. I mean, obviously, jobs have always been a grind, but if the reward was commensurate to the grind and you were able to get a full life out of it, then that was at least a worthy trade-off, even if the job itself was not really that pleasant. And then, of course, fast forward to today, and you get all the misery of a job, but it doesn't even let you get close to living a normal life. I know decades ago, there was the idea of a family wage, and that, a man could just graduate high school in many cases and didn't even have to go to college. He could come out of high school, he could get a job, maybe a factory job or, something in manufacturing perhaps, in his town, in his city. And that would be enough to support a family, buy a house, buy the family car, all that stuff. And I mean, it's been, I don't know, you don't even hear the term family wage. That hasn't been a thing for decades. And it has deteriorated so much that now a there can be a childless couple where they both work and they still can't really do more than just kind of barely make it through. And if you're an individual, no spouse, no children, even just doing kind of the bare minimum with life, you still just can't make it. You can't afford anything. And then, of course, couples with children there aren't nearly as many in, millennials and younger as there were for Gen X and baby boomers and before. But when you do see them, they're not doing that well financially. And I know there's some kinds of spending that, our parents and grandparents didn't really have. Um, I know decades ago a restaurant meal was a special occasion type of thing. And now it seems like no matter how bad the economy gets and how bad unemployment gets, that restaurants are still packed everywhere. Or at least it seems that way. And don't worry, I'm not going to blame avocado toast on people not being able to afford a house, but I'm, just an observation. Maybe they're just putting it on the credit card, or I don't know. And then, of course, today everything's a subscription. It's like everything's a subscription except for oxygen itself, and that's probably coming within our lifetimes, I guess. But I remember growing up, and if you're a millennial, you probably remember this growing up too. If you're a millennial, you had grandparents who, maybe were born around the time of the Great Depression, and they were young when World War II happened, and so that was a lot of their formative years were during those, really difficult, catastrophic times. But I know I heard from my grandparents, and this was, way back in the '90s and the early 2000s, that things used to be a lot cheaper. They would talk about that sometimes, or I've heard from them before that, oh, you just had to go to high school and that was enough to get a good job. And so it's crazy how even years and years ago and decades ago that, our grandparents, if you're a millennial, your grandparents were almost certainly telling you how things used to be. And now that we're already, around middle age, we're already lamenting the loss of our good old days. But anyway, that's maybe also another video. So I realized that what we take as normal, or what's supposed to be normal, like the American dream kind of lifestyle. I mean, I know there was a buildup to that. It didn't just start out that way. It certainly hasn't been that way for all of history. This is very much a post World War II social and political and geopolitical order that let that happen. So I do understand that. I I'm guessing you could argue that the concepts of it were maybe hammered out during the American Revolution, and then I know the Industrial Revolution changed a lot of things, and after the Civil War and Reconstruction, things were gradually changing economically, and then I'm sure by the time of the First World War, there was definitely a big part of society that had moved had come a long way from the more simple agrarian kind of lifestyle and society that was more common before industrialization. Then there was all that, and of course the Roaring Twenties, and then the Great Depression, which put a damper on things for a decade, and then World War II, and then finally after that we got the current order. And I think now we're in the probably the final years of the post World War II economic order, which makes sense because it's been about 4 generations. And just an aside, if you've never read The Fourth Turning, which was written, I think like maybe 94, 95, it was written around 30 years ago. But in my opinion, it explains a lot about where we're at now. I think the surviving author wrote a companion book or a sequel book or whatever you would call it and released it fairly recently. I haven't read that one yet. But yeah, you should go read that if you've never read it before or haven't heard of it before. It's called The Fourth Turning. But I think these generational cycles really explain a lot of things. And, there's kind of two ways of looking at history, and one is, linear. So it's the view of things, or the view of history is more of a straight line, like everything was just leading up to now, and it was just this never-ending line of progress. And then, of course, the other idea is cyclical history, which is things happen generationally and secularly, which, secular, of course, is about a human, human lifetimes. And so things kind of happen and they grow and develop, and then there's the coming and going of different generations, and that basically on a bigger timeline results in historical patterns. That's how that thinking goes. But anyway, I think the system that came out of the end of World War II and sort of the American dream conception of how society should be, I think overall it was a good system. Now, it was never going to last forever. I guess, like the old truism goes, the good things in life just don't last. But I think it's remembered so well because the general trajectory was upward. So even if you were poor, there was still the hope of, okay, my kids will do better than I've done, or things will get better in the future. And that's something that we definitely don't have today. And I would say the expectation is generally completely opposite. There's the expectation that you need to enjoy things while you got them because it's only getting worse, it's only getting more expensive, it's only getting harder to survive out there. And I'm sure there's plenty of people out there, especially in YouTube land, who would criticize the old concept of the American dream and whatnot. But there really was a long buildup to get to this kind of, very civilized version of things. Because I know back in the industrial era, you had things like child labor. You had these very excessive uh, work shifts, 12 and 14 and 16 hours, and, maybe no days off. And, I know it could get really bad, especially back in the 19th century. And, things that we take for granted now, like, workplace safety and OSHA and all this stuff, back then were just not a thing. If you were poor and you really needed those industrial factory jobs, you just put up with the conditions you were offered, and you didn't make much money and you didn't get much free time, and there wasn't, it sounded like a very rough life. So it seems like a shame to me that, the American dream of, around 1945 till the present day, has only lasted a few generations, because we may never see that again in world history, quite like it happened in the US after the war. And another part of all that, which probably would also be another video to really discuss in depth, was just more about how people were more connected, and there was a greater social fabric, and the social contract was stronger, and all this stuff. Which again, I'm sure people, especially out in YouTube land, could tear apart back and forth all day long. And I'm sure some of that stuff that sounds very positive back then about how people were more connected and things like that. But to go back to the, hearing stories from grandparents growing up thing, another story I remember is about Henry Ford and his decision to pay his workers more so that they could afford to buy the automobiles that they were putting together on the assembly line. And I'm sure that either that was embellished, or maybe is maybe was seen by people who grew up back then as through rose-colored glasses or whatnot, or even if it was completely true. I'm sure it wasn't out of the goodness of his heart, because after all, if you pay your workers more, then you're retaining good talent, and that makes it easier to raise a family, which families produce people who become workers. So there's definitely self-interest, but I think, one of the things back then is it was seen as it was just good all around. And, contrast that to now. I mean, could you imagine Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk really doing something to benefit the people, or to benefit the working man, or something like that? I mean, again, I'm sure people could dissect those kinds of statements back and forth all day long, but it definitely wouldn't seem so likely nowadays. But anyway, yeah, then you get to the end of World War II. And I know I'm jumping back and forth a lot here, but yeah, you get to the end of World War II, and then you have the baby boomers, who are regarded as the most selfish generation, I guess. And, they grew up in this exceedingly prosperous time, it, certainly the most prosperous economy in living memory. And then along the way, they got, I guess it depends on which version of things you believe, or whose perspective you accept, but they got bored, or they felt disconnected, and they just got uh, disillusioned with sort of the easy street kind of life and economy, and the social expectations. And, I'm sure there was pressure and everything. I mean, every generation has that. And of course, they had a really big sway on things, and they still have a big sway on things just simply because they were a huge generation. I mean, they were called baby boomers for a reason. But then you get to the 60s, and of course, a lot of people will refer to that as when things really started going off the rails in the US, and things have just, they will say, oh, things started really getting bad there, and they spiraled into the insanity we have today. So my perspective on that is that things accelerated then, but the things that have really gone awry were really set in place long before that even. But yeah, basically you had people, and again, I know it wasn't everybody, um, but you had a certain portion or segment of the baby boomer generation trying to find themselves and obviously expand their consciousness. You had all that kind of stuff going on, and then you had as part of all that, you had what's I've heard referred to or read referred to as the consciousness revolution, which I haven't heard that term a lot, but that I guess is what it's called, or some people call it that, the consciousness revolution. So basically, so maybe navel gazing, or just looking for themselves, depending on how you want to look at it, with all the fun ways that they try to do that. And I guess that came out of a time when there was just so much comfort and things were easy enough. And if they really wanted to do the kind of straight and narrow, like go to work and play by the rules and do what you're supposed to do kind of thing, that kind of prosperity was always there if they ever wanted to go back to that. And I know, of course, some did, which they I think a lot of those same people became the yuppies of the 1980s. Who went from navel gazers to materialistic, status chasing young urban professionals. But yeah, you had all these social changes, all these movements. You had like second wave feminism that really changed the social fabric and kind of modified some terms of the social contract and greatly changed the idea of family formation. Then you had technologies and whatnot, like the birth control pill, which again played into changing the idea of family formation and all this stuff, and changed certain social conventions. But yeah, basically with all that stuff that accelerated in the 60s, it just strained society. And, for a time, and if you talk to people who were young during that period, they tend to look at it very positively. And obviously part of that is you tend to see the times when you grew up as very positive usually, or when you were a young adult. But I think part of it too is that you had the kind of the old going out and the new coming in. And at the point in history where they were meeting, I think there were enough benefits of both for a while that probably a lot of young adults back then were fairly happy, because you thought, okay, I get to do this new stuff, this fun stuff, try this new way of life that my, parents and grandparents couldn't have even dreamed of. But, at the end of the day, there's still kind of the traditional life, and I can, pursue that, and it's always going to be there, which of course it wasn't. But anyway, so you get to the 1980s and you have the yuppies, and it's kind of the navel gazing, consciousness expanding baby boomers became these vapid and spiritually impoverished, status seeking, materialistic types, that were focused on consumption and lifestyle and whatnot. And I think that we're still we still have that kind of culture, and we may be in the final years of that, just because people don't have the incomes or the hope that they'll have the financial means to even pursue that kind of lifestyle. It's becoming the domain of a few people on the internet who are flashy and show off and make all that YouTube money or whatever. But anyway, so I'm getting at that all of these social strains over time and all these times when things deteriorated have just led to this kind of absurd society we find ourselves in nowadays. And so now the concepts of things just do not make sense anymore. Like I was saying before, a job, like a job. What is a job? Well, after World War II, we knew what it was, and even during, say, industrial times, people knew what it was. But now, I mean, what is a job? It doesn't let you pay the bills in most cases. It doesn't let you afford to get married and have a family. So, what really is a job? The very concept of it and what it's supposed to be has been lost. And to keep with the topic of jobs, another absurdity is instead of a job, it's called a career. So, my understanding, I'm not 100% sure, but I think it came out of the 60s, kind of around the second wave feminism era. And instead of a job, it was a career. It was to make it basically sound like it was something more high and mighty than it really was for most people. But now you go to apply to some 20-hour a week seasonal job at some big box store, and they'll call it a career when it won't even pay half your bills, when it won't even pay a quarter of your bills. It's strange terminology, this bizarro terminology that's just carried over into these times of social and economic decline we're living through. And another absurdity with jobs is that your company, your employer will almost certainly call your workplace a family. And that's one that personally ticks me off because I'm thinking, you're not my family. I'm not your family. You're not coming to my funeral. I'm not coming to yours. We're not a family. You're an employer and I'm a worker. And these are just bizarre and sometimes even cruel sounding euphemisms that just sound like a bad joke on a good day. And so this is where we are now, where we have a lot of the terminology and sort of broadly the old conventions that used to make sense 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago, but they don't actually function the way they were meant to anymore. And we're just kind of masquerading at this big old fake performance called society. So to go back to the 80s for a second, around the time when you had the yuppies and the solidly working age baby boomers who had grown up and all that, you had something called the two income trap. And that was something that at the time was actually talked about. I remember this growing up in the 90s, but you would actually hear that. There were books written about it. I think it was on TV shows or like news specials or things like that. You definitely saw it and heard it around. And the two income trap was the idea that instead of a man working a singular job to provide for his family and that being enough, now the husband and wife both had to work. And back then it was actually seen as a problem. And what's crazy is stuff like that just gets normalized. So whatever you think about all that stuff, I'm not, making judgments about it in this video, but I'm just saying the conventions come about, they get distorted, people notice the problem and notice the changes, and even if they don't like it, they just seem helpless to prevent it being normalized. So now, though, we don't have the two income trap because it's deteriorated beyond that, and now two incomes are often not enough to live a basic life. You've got individuals working 2 and 3 jobs who can't do it or are just barely hanging on. You've got couples who have a job each, 2 incomes, or they may both have 2 jobs or whatever, and they're just barely able to make it. Or maybe they struggle to even have 1 kid, things like that. And so the thing is, it doesn't stop here. I think we all know that by now. It doesn't stop here. How bad does it get before the dam breaks? I don't know. I don't think anyone really knows that. And it's not actually going to be obvious that it was going to happen until after it happens is how I think. I think history bears that out. But, I think one of the things that reasserts itself in times of collapse, and I don't just mean decline, but collapse, things are falling apart, things aren't functioning anymore, the old way of life can't be sustained, is that over time, a simpler, less complex, more quote unquote traditional way of life and all the roles and details that entailed reassert themselves. So in a sense, things are still relatively good because, some Redditor can go buy 100 Funko Pops tomorrow and it's going to be there and he's going to be able to put that on a credit card and go into debt for his Funko Pops, and the system's going to keep perpetuating a little bit longer. That's declined, but it still functions. In other words, it still has momentum and it's still going, it's still moving. But if we get to a time when there's an actual famine, and it's not just the food is expensive, but maybe there is no food, or there are not certain kinds of food, or maybe store shelves are empty, or maybe a lot of them are empty, or maybe they'll be empty sometimes but not all the time, but you don't know when they'll be empty and when there will be something, or you don't know what the price will be between today and tomorrow. Things like that. That would be collapse. It's not really functioning anymore. So that's when more sensible, simple, less complex things would reassert themselves. So, like I said, I don't know how close we are to all that. I don't think anyone does. But the path to getting back to a more sensible way of life is not quick and painless. It seems like you see people LARPing on the internet about, well, we're going to go back to traditionalism, whatever that means. And, well, we're just going to get a cabin in the woods and we're going to prep and, we're just going to ride it out. And then when things are fine, we're just going to, go back in and we're going to live a 1950s lifestyle or whatever. You see this kind of LARPing everywhere, it seems like. And that's not how it's going to work. It is a long, drawn out, painful process. That's what a collapse is. A collapse is not ripping a Band-Aid off. It is a serious thing that is quite painful to get through, and a lot of people don't make it to the other side of it to see anything better emerge. And collapse can be political, economic, geopolitical, social. I mean, there's a lot of forms it can take, and I suspect we're probably going to get some of all of it. Anyway, I don't have any solutions to offer. I just find it morbidly fascinating to talk about. And all this, and we haven't even touched on the AI future that doesn't seem to have people in mind, that's looming over us, and all this stuff. There's really a whole lot that can go wrong, and it just doesn't seem like there's a whole lot that can go right from this point forward. But I'm planning to make more videos just talking about this stuff and sharing my thoughts and observations and whatnot. If you've got anything you'd like to share, please let me know in the comments. Just kind of your experience with what you're seeing out in society and how bad things are getting. I know I've seen some things just this past few days that I'm going to make some videos about, because I've seen just some everyday things that have shocked me, which is crazy because I consider myself someone who kind of keeps up with this kind of thing. But yeah, please share your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. If you'd like, and subscribe and leave a comment, that would help me out. And I appreciate you listening if you made it this far. And try not to let everything get you down.